the Shenandoah Valley. So God bless you, Doug, for that. And if you're going to mention Doug, you got to mention his family. His lovely wife, Megan, is here. Want to raise your hand? Most of the key to Doug's success. They also have 12 children, which helps to explain why Doug is so focused on building a good school for his kids. Doug also, in his spare time, spends time running his vineyard, Capstone Vineyards in Linden, Virginia, which is part hobby, part business, I think, since Doug loves wine. But I think to encapsulate Doug, I wanted to mention a little bit that you can talk about someone and say, hey, that guy's a Catholic attorney. And you can mean one of two things. You can mean an attorney who happens to be Catholic, right? Or you can mean an attorney whose Catholic faith informs everything that he does. And I think Doug is the latter. It's why he's an amazing advisor in estate planning issues, because he actually approaches it from a Catholic perspective and thinks about things that often many of us don't. But that's also why he's just a great advisor, because he cares for his clients as individual sons and daughters of Christ. Doug has been a great friend of Christendom. He always has a lot of wise advice, and I appreciate all the time you give to us. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was way too generous, by the way. It's been, I think, this is my 6th or 7th year doing this talk, estate planning seminar. This year's topic is legacy, and legacy is really about telling a story. It's understanding what's been. That's what legacy is all about. So today's discussion is going to be a little bit different than in the past, in that we're going to talk a lot about stories. Having done this for 6, 7 years, I look around and I see a lot of familiar faces. I see former attendees who are now clients. I see friends. I see family. So it seems year after year, people show up for this event over and over again, and it's amazing to me when you consider that it's always on the coldest, windiest day of December every year, and people still come to this. So there must be some story behind that. Why do people brave the wind and sometimes the rain and the snow to come to this every year? I don't think the food is great, but I don't think it's the food or the drinks. I think the company is wonderful, so it may be to catch up with old friends. But I was reading a book recently about how do we understand things when we have questions. How do we understand? Human beings understand things primarily through creating stories. So we can look at data, we can look at facts, we can have experiences, but we can't really understand them without, in our minds, weaving them into a story of sorts. That's how we understand things. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. So as I'm trying to figure out why do people keep coming back to Christendom, in my mind I can start to create a story. Okay, so I imagine, why would someone come to Christendom on a cold, windy day to listen to Doug McCarthy again for the 7th year in a row? How did they get here in the first place? How did Christmas at Christendom come to be? So I can create a story in my mind. And I imagine, 10, 15 years ago, Dr. Tim O'Donnell is sitting in a back room over in the administrative office, and he calls a couple of his staff in, his lieutenants in. And in my mind, I imagine it's Paul Jalsevec and John Siskanik. I don't know if it was, but that's the story that in my mind that I'm thinking about. And I'm imagining they're all sitting in wingback chairs with a crackling fire. My Wild Irish Rose is softly playing in the background. And all 3 of them are wearing tweed vests, because in my mind, that's what I imagine a meeting with Dr. O'Donnell is like at Christendom. And Dr. O'Donnell says, "Gentlemen, I've always known that at some point we would realize that the tuition that we're charging our families for the education of their boys and girls was not going to be enough to cover the costs of their education, but much less the maintenance and the upkeep of our buildings and our infrastructure, or the building of new buildings and infrastructure, or the cost of extending the reach of Christendom beyond Front Royal to the greater world the way that Dr. Carroll envisioned it. I knew someday we were going to have to go outside of these families and start to ask for help in the mission that Dr. Carroll and the founders started. I knew we'd have to bring people in and get them tied into the mission of Christendom and get them convinced that they should be supporters. And gentlemen, I think that day has come. And I want it to be this year that you bring people to Christendom, to the campus, so they can experience the Christendom experience, understand the vision and the mission and how important it is, and buy in and invest in the future of that vision. It's that important. And Paul, as Paul always does when Dr. O'Donnell asks him to do something, says, "Yes, absolutely, whatever you say." And he immediately, this was 15 years ago or so, 14 years ago, he probably pulled a I don't know, what did they have, BlackBerry or something out of his pocket. He didn't have an iPhone. So he looks at the calendar and he says, well, if we're going to do it this year, and we're not going to interfere with studies, and we're not going to interfere with holiday breaks, Christmas break, Thanksgiving break, really the only day left for us to do this is on St. Nicholas Day. That's the only day on the calendar we can get this done. And Dr. O'Donnell thinks about it and says, I love St. Nicholas. Everyone loves St. Nicholas. He comes and fills your shoes with candy and treats. He was a very generous bishop, very generous saint. But I'm just not sure that St. Nicholas Day is a great day to have people, donors, coming out to Christendom. I mean, think about it. There's no leaves on the trees, or at least the ones that are there are brown. The flowers are all dead. It's so cold, most of the students are like cooped up inside. They're not out lounging in the grass, like reading Aristotle and Aquinas and having profound conversations. The stuff that we want our donors to see them doing. I just don't think St. Nicholas Day is going to be the day to do it. But, John Siskanik's like, yeah, but Dr. O'Donnell, if you say we have to get this done, then we have to get this done. We need to find a way to get this done. And besides, St. Nicholas, he was so much more than just stuffing shoes full of candy. I mean, St. Nicholas, single-handedly beat the Arian heresy. He's out there, punching bishops in the nose and going to prison, and, he was the man. We can get people to come out for St. Nicholas Day, so we'll do St. Nicholas at Christendom. And Dr. O'Donnell says, yeah, I love St. Nicholas too, John. Don't get me wrong, I love St. Nicholas. But I'm just not sure that's going to be the draw. People will have excuses. They're not going to come. They'll say, well, I spent the whole morning filling shoes with candy. I don't have time to come to Christendom. Or, I'm still a little tired from Thanksgiving. Or I didn't see those other grandchildren from the other side of the country, so I'm going to go see them. There's all these excuses for why they can't come to Christendom for St. Nicholas Day. And John says, that's a really good point. He said, well, how about this? St. Nicholas is associated with Christmas, right? Because he's associated sometimes with Santa Claus. So what if we tied the two together and said that, it's about Christmas? I mean, after all, the day after Thanksgiving, everyone's putting up their trees, they're putting up their lights, they're listening to Christmas carols. No, Catholics aren't doing this, but other people are doing this. Why don't we say it's going to be come to Christendom for Christmas? That'll get people to come. That's more exciting. And Dr. O'Donnell gets this scowl on his face, and he looks at John and says, John, I cannot believe you just suggested that. John, you of all people know, as everyone here knows, that Christendom is the most faithful, Orthodox Catholic institution on the face of the planet. And if we tell people it's Christmas in the middle of Advent, can you imagine the backlash that we're going to get? We can't do that. And Paul, who's been quiet this whole time, says, hold on a minute, Dr. O'Donnell. You know that before I came to Christendom, I was actually a trained attorney, and I worked in a law firm. And as a trained attorney, it's my job to take things that sound like they shouldn't be done and make it so that we can do it. So I'm thinking about this, Can we stipulate that Christmas, in its essence, really is the celebration of Christ's birth? It's Jesus' birthday. And Dr. O'Donnell says, well, yes, I think we can all agree that, in essence, Christmas is Jesus' birth. He says, so therefore, if it's the celebration of Jesus' birth, isn't it really, it's a celebration of Jesus' birthday? It's a birthday party. Dr. O'Donnell says, you're stretching a little bit, but yeah, I guess we can agree it's Jesus' birthday party. And he says, and wouldn't you also agree that on occasion, if family and friends aren't available on someone's birthday, that they may celebrate the birthday a few days early, a week early? That happens, right? And Dr. O'Donnell says, I think I see where you're going with this, Paul. Yes, I think we can do that. So I think legally speaking, we can say, you're not coming to Christendom for Christmas. We're having Christmas at Christendom. It just happens to be in Advent. And that's, thanks to Paul, how Christmas or Christendom began. At least that's the story in my mind. Now, that's probably not a true story. I don't know. Is it true? Partially true. But this is the way that we come to understand things. We try to take things, we weave them together into stories. And some stories are true, and some stories are not true. And some stories are better than others, and some stories are stories that we would want to be told, and a lot of stories are stories that we would not want to be told. And that's what our life from birth until death is really all about, is being part of a story and weaving a story together. Now, a true story is about 8 years ago, John Siskanik actually did call me, and he said, Doug, I'd like you to come to Christendom and give a talk on estate planning. And I said, John, that sounds kind of boring. And he said, well, here's why. He said, I have a lot of donors who give a lot of money to Christendom during their lifetime. But when I ask them, hey, have you made some type of provision in your will or your trust for the benefit of Christendom College, they don't just say no. They say, you know what, I never even thought of that. I never considered that I could do that. My lawyer never even asked, would you like to make a donation? You know, I was just thinking, how do I take care of my wife, my husband? How do I take care of the kids? That was kind of the sphere of thinking around my estate planning. So no, I'm glad you mentioned it because I never thought about it. How do I do that? And John said, and the other thing is, I have a lot of people who are great supporters of Christendom. Maybe they don't have a lot of money to give to Christendom now during their lifetime, but they would love to give whatever they have left over after they're gone to the college once they know that they've taken care of themselves and their children and those types of things. But they don't have any estate plan in place, and they would love to learn how to have an estate plan that could eventually benefit Christendom. So that's why I want you to come and give this talk. So I said, John, absolutely. I'm happy to come in. And for 2 years, I gave a talk on the sort of practical aspects of estate planning: wills, trusts, medical powers of attorney, which are really important, especially to have a good Catholic medical power of attorney, powers of attorney, general durable powers of attorney. And after about 2 years of talking about how to avoid probate, how to avoid taxes, how to make things easier when someone passes away, I started to get kind of bored. And I said to John, John, if I'm getting bored, the people sitting in the seats are probably starting to get a little bored too. I said, would you mind if I try to figure out something that would be more enticing, more exciting, might get people a little bit more thoughtful about estate planning? And he said, go for it. Come back and let me know what you're thinking about. So I actually did. I went and I thought a lot about the donors in particular, people that come to this event, all of you. I thought about you, and I'm thinking, what is it really that makes you come back? It's not that we're having a birthday party for Jesus per se. It's not the food per se. There are elements of the camaraderie with friends, but that's not the primary reason that people are coming back. People come here because there's something about Christendom that regardless of how cold it is or how windy it is or rainy or snowy, you're going to come here. You're going to brave it. You're going to brave the elements and endure a little bit of suffering because there's something really important happening here. That's what keeps bringing you back. There's something in your experience, either as a Christendom student or the parent of a Christendom student or having just been around Christendom, that you're being sort of called to. There's a hole somewhere in your heart that's being filled by Christendom. And so I started thinking, what is it about Christendom College that has that effect on people, that has them wanting to come and support the college and leave bequests in their wills and make it part of their legacy? And I think about the vision of the founders, and I settled on the motto, and it's to restore all things in Christ. And I want you to think about this for just a minute. It's not to build all things in Christ, or to construct all things in Christ, or to do all things in Christ, or to strive for all things in Christ. It's restore all things in Christ. And that's really important to think about. What does restoration imply? It implies that something is missing or has faded or is gone or is lost or has been tarnished. When you restore an old property, the property is still there. It's not that it wasn't ever existing. The property is there, and there's a remembrance of what it was, either through a photograph or a painting or a memory of what that property used to look like, and we want to restore it back to its full former glory. That was the vision, in a way, of the founders of Christendom College. It wasn't to create something new in Christ. It was to restore something that was so great, something so wonderful, something so glorious, but was lost. It was something still in their memory, and that they saw in their travels, that they saw in their studies and their reading, that they knew we have to get back to this thing that we've lost. And I think all of us that come to this every year, we understand that. We understand that in a very sort of primal way, that we're missing something. Our community is missing something. Our church is missing something. Our families are missing out on something. There's something that needs to be restored. We know it was there at one time, but it's not there now. But when we come here, we can feel it. It's here, right? So that's what keeps people coming back to Christendom. That's the real story of Christmas at Christendom. We come back to this place because we're missing something. So I was thinking about, what does it mean to have that kind of loss? To know that there was something really great, but it's no longer at the level that it used to be. It's no longer as beautiful. It's not working for its intended purpose like it used to be. And I thought, if our culture has lost something that fundamental, it has to invade and infect everything in our lives. It invades our families and how our families see the world and themselves and their role with one another. It infects our church and how our church leaders and the church faithful and the church laity interact and believe and cooperate with one another. It infects our daily work. It infects everything. And so I started to think, how has it affected me? What have I lost? What is it that I don't even know that I've lost? And I started to think about this talk, this estate planning talk. And I realized, I've been focusing for the last 2 or 3 years on talking about the practical things. This is what you do to create an estate plan. But what am I not aware of that is really a Catholic way of looking at estate planning? So I went back and I started studying old wills from 400, 500 years ago from England and France. I started looking at court cases around estates. I went to the Bible and read the Bible from beginning to end again, and specifically looking for examples of estates and inheritance. And I can tell you that inheritance is one of the top topics throughout the entire Old and New Testament. And we don't often think about it that way, but it is. And I realized that's what we've lost as Catholics when we do estate planning. All of us in this room, to a certain extent, are ignorant of what real Catholic estate planning is all about. And that's what I want to talk about. And we started that conversation last year, so if you were here last year, you got a little bit of a glimpse of this. And some of what I say may be sort of a refresher of that. But for those of you who are new, I want to talk about what is Catholic estate planning and what does that mean for your story and your legacy and the legacy that will touch and be woven into everyone else's story and legacy. So first and foremost, how many of you have a will or a trust or some type of estate plan in place? Okay, most of you. And I ask this every year, and the same people raise their hands every year. And how many of you went to a Catholic estate planning attorney to get your, yes, thank you, Jim. A few of you. And how many of you went to a Catholic estate planning attorney, and when you went in, they said, okay, we want to discuss how to hand off your assets, but we also want to talk about your eternal soul. Just Adam. Okay, we got a couple. That's an important part of estate planning, and people forget that sometimes. As Catholics, our life does not end at death. It's just beginning, right? So when we're talking about estate planning, we really should be talking about the Catholic view of estates. And when you go back in time and you look at old wills, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about who gets what. And it's because everyone knew who got what. The oldest son got everything. So there wasn't a whole lot of planning that needed to be done, right? But the wills back then were a lot longer than the wills are now. Okay? Do you know why? Because the wills in the old days were truly a last will and testament. It was the communication of the desires, wishes, dreams, sometimes admonishments of a parent to their progeny. It was, my dear son, I'm so proud of what you've made. I hope that you continue to build, what you've been working on and continue to do well. Or, my dear son, you are a mess. If you don't turn your life around, I'm afraid you're going to go to hell. And because of that, I'm not giving you a darn thing until I've got evidence that you've turned your life around. Or, my dear son, I really liked that girl that you were dating, when you were 17. She's the one I really want you to marry. So if you marry her, I'll give you everything. But if you don't, then you get nothing. These were the things that people were talking about. They were talking about how do we maintain what we have, the traditions of our family, the traditions of our community, the traditions of our culture. It's all there in the documents. And if you go back and you look at one of our most ancient documents on estate planning, the Bible, you see the same thing there. Now, that's not to say that stuff wasn't transmitted and inherited in the Bible. It certainly was. We all remember the story of Esau and giving up the birthright and those types of things. But inheritance is well beyond just stuff. Now, in our pagan day and age, it's about stuff. If you go into your estate planning attorney, what is the attorney typically going to ask you if they're not a good Catholic estate planning attorney? They can say, okay, make me a list of all of your things, your house, your retirement accounts, your bank accounts, your cars, any heirlooms, things that you have sort of sentimental value, and we'll discuss how we're going to give them away to the next generation. And that's about the extent of it. It doesn't go much beyond that. And that indicates to us that we are a pagan culture. And how do we know that? If you go back in time and you open the graves of the pagan cultures, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, the Vikings, what do you find in their graves? Stuff. You find gold and silver. You find food and weapons. You even find animals, horses, Because in their minds, those were the things that had value, and I'm going to need that in the next life. I can't part. I'm so connected to my stuff and my materials. I need these things. Now, think about today. It's sad. Hopefully, none of you are going to funerals like this, but I've gone to funerals where father dies. His trusty dog was put down so that the dog could be put in the coffin because we can't let dad be separated from his best friend. Or my dad, dad played golf, so we need to put golf clubs or golf balls in his casket. These things are happening again because we are a pagan culture once again. So when you look at Christendom, when you look at what were things like when our culture and our society was truly informed by the values taught to us by our Catholic faith, what does that look like? Open the graves of the ancient, they're not that ancient, Christians, the early Christians. Open the graves of the medieval Christians. Open the graves of our grandparents and our great-grandparents. What do you find in those graves? Bones. Maybe some scraps of cloth. Dust. That's it. That's the difference between us and the pagans, is we know that the material stuff doesn't really matter that much. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be good stewards and focus on making sure that we're passing it on appropriately to the next generation. But as Catholics, as Christians, the stuff isn't the most important thing. When we talk about the Catholic faith, what do we talk about? We talk about the tradition of the Catholic faith. Unlike Protestants, we don't believe everything is right in that book. It's not all between the pages of Genesis through Revelation. There's a whole lot more out there, right? How do we know that? Because we share it through from one generation to the next. We carry on a tradition. So our faith is rich in tradition. This is what Christendom is built on, is the tradition. And we're always just one generation away from losing it all, from losing the tradition. That's what legacy is really all about. Legacy is an unbroken chain in the story, from the beginning to the end, to the next generation, to the next generation. That's what we should all be focused on. Memento mori. We're going to die. Yes, we can't get around that. But what's left when we're gone? We're all part of a long story, and we have a part to play. And what I want to sort of get you all to think about at this point, most of you probably have your estate planning done, and there probably doesn't need to be a whole lot of changes to your estate plan. But I do want you to start thinking about, what part do I want to play in the story? You're all playing a part, whether you want to or not, whether you realize it or not. But who do you want to be? Who do you want to be remembered as? A donor to Christendom. Okay, that's great. But what does that really mean? That reminds me of the story of the bricklayer. A man walks up to a man laying stones. He's a mason. He's laying stones. And the man asks the mason, "What are you doing?" And the mason says, "Well, I'm laying stones. I lay one on top of the other. I cut them so that they fit, and I put one stone on top of the other." And the man continues down the lane just a little bit further and comes across another mason. He says, "Sir, what are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm building a wall. I lay these stones one on top of the other. I'm building this wall. It's going to be a great wall. It's going to be a beautiful wall." Sounds like Donald Trump there for a minute. The most beautiful wall. And then he walks down the lane a little bit further and he says to another mason, he says, "What are you doing, sir?" And he says, "I'm building a cathedral." They're all doing the exact same job, but the vision that one man has for what he's doing is so much greater than the vision that the first man had. And that's what we should be thinking about is, am I just a donor to Christendom College? Or am I building a chapel the size of a cathedral? Or am I restoring all things in Christ? Am I bringing back the reign of Jesus Christ to earth? This is what you should be thinking about, because this is what you get to pass on to the next generation. That's something worth living for. That's something worth working for. That's what I want you all to start thinking about when you're doing estate planning, because it informs the decisions that you make now and the decisions that will be carried out after you're gone. So for instance, we're all expected to suffer in this life. There's no way around that, and we've all suffered much, I'm sure. But suffering is really good. Suffering is one of the things that brings us the most joy and the most satisfaction in life, too. It is, in a way, suffering to give to charitable organizations because you're denying something of yourself. It's especially hard for parents to give to charitable organizations or charitable work, because not only are they denying something from themselves, but in their minds, they're also denying something to their children, because it's either their time or their money. Because as parents, we want to give everything we can to our children. But for the betterment of society, sometimes we have to deny something to the kids, and they don't get everything. We want to give it to the charity. So think about, who are you? Are you a sacrificial person? If you are, then think about, how am I best to do that? Think about, am I a good steward? I have lots of clients who will leave millions and millions of dollars to their kids, and the kids come in after their death, and they leave bitter and unhappy because they didn't experience love or appreciation. Their parents never told them they were proud of them. And then I have other kids who come in whose parents had nothing to leave to them, and they leave overjoyed because the parents left them a love letter that said, I'm really proud of you, and I'm proud of who you've become as a person. I have hope that you'll do great things. You've been, a light in my life. These are the things to think about when we're doing estate planning. So it really comes down to, what do you want your story to be? Do you want your story to be of the bitter children that you left lots of money to? Not that leaving money to all kids is going to make them bitter. Or do you want to make sure that your children remember you for the love? Do you want to make sure your community remembers you for the cathedral that you built, or restoring Christendom? And are you going to have a legacy where your children will pick up the mantle from where you left it and continue on? So that's what I'd like you to think about. And there's ways to do this. So I'm going to shift now the story, the legacy, to how do you do that? That's great to think in these sort of philosophical tones about, okay, how do I leave a legacy, or what the legacy will be? How do I do that? So first and foremost, have something in writing, something that will survive your death. And that can be your last will and testament, your trust. It can be a letter. It can be, in this day and age, it can be a video. It can be all kinds of things. But memorialize in some way what your life was really all about. There are lots of ways to do that. Through estate planning, through your giving. I mean, if you walk over to the chapel right now, you'll see little plaques from donors all over the walls. That, in a way, is part of the legacy. It's part of the story. People for decades, maybe centuries, will read those and in their own minds weave together the story of your life as part of this larger tapestry of the restoration of Christendom. Start to think about things like, what do I need to do to prepare myself for the rest of my life, my eternal life, not just hand off my estate? For instance, how many of you in your estate planning have any type of instruction as far as your requiem mass, funeral arrangements, those types of things? A few of you, but not very many of you. That's one of the most important things you can do for yourself. In this day and age, and you can ask the priests here, there are lots of kids who will say, I don't believe in that stuff, it's superstitious. I know mom or dad would have wanted to have that mass, but let's just have a memorial. We'll go ahead and bury him now. We'll have a memorial service in the summer when it's a little bit warmer. No. You need to have a funeral mass with your body present, your remains present, so that you receive the grace of that mass. It's not about the kids. They don't understand that. It's not about them. It's not about the people you're leaving behind. It's about you. Most of us need all the help we can get, right? You need to have that in writing, in your estate plan. I want a requiem mass. I want a funeral mass. And you may want to appoint someone specifically to have dominion over your final remains to make sure that happens. Because all too often, parents will say in their estate plan, I want to have a funeral mass, but then the card-carrying communist son decides, I'm going to ignore that. And that's not a joke. I often tell this story, but it was tragic. A father, he was Episcopalian, he was almost Catholic. His daughter married a wonderful Catholic man, converted to the Catholic faith, became just on fire with the faith. She loved the faith. She was on the cusp of converting him right up to the day he died. I'm hopeful that he converted before his death, but we don't know. But he had become so sort of enamored with the faith that he understood the importance of prayers for the dead and being buried and not being cremated and all of these types of things and having his ashes scattered to the wind. But the children that he had raised, his sons, one was literally a communist, an avowed communist, and hated everything about the faith. When father died, the father had written his intentions. I want to be buried in the graveyard with my parents, and I want you to pray for me there. And the sons said, no, we're going to cremate him. We're going to take him and cremate him, and we're going to scatter his ashes across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Well, it was 1 against 2. So the daughter pled, and she said, hey, can we compromise? How about if you cremate him, you don't scatter him across the Blue Ridge. At least scatter him in the graveyard where his parents are buried. And the brothers said, whatever, fine. So the day of his funeral, they scattered his ashes in the graveyard. This woman's husband, very good Catholic, that evening got his shop vac and went up to the graveyard in the middle of the night in the Episcopalian graveyard and sucked up the ashes of his father-in-law and took them to Harper's Ferry and buried them in the churchyard. With his own dead son, his infant son. That's why you need to write these things down, so no family ever has to experience that type of heartache. Okay? So that's just an admonition. Write these things down and make sure the people that you have assigned are going to do the right thing and carry out your true last will and testament. You have the benefit from the treasury of grace that God has given us of requesting what are called Gregorian masses. Anyone have Gregorian masses written into their estate plan? A few. Gregorian masses, 30 consecutive days of masses being said for your soul. The church says that if we do that, then we will be released from the pains of purgatory and allowed to receive the beatific vision. Who in their right minds wouldn't want to have 30 days of masses said for them and get out of jail, right? That's the love that Christ had for us when he died on the cross. He gave us that. And we're all ignorant of it. Most priests don't know about the Gregorian masses. This is what we've lost. This is what happens when we no longer live in a culture that's guided by Christendom. These are the things that we need to rediscover. So take advantage of that. If you don't have a Catholic attorney, or if you have a Catholic attorney who's more secular than Catholic, go back to them and say, I want to have these written in. I want to have something that says, take from my estate a stipend and pay a priest to say, the 30 days of masses, give them the stipend, get it done. Make sure that there's something in there that says, I'm going to have a funeral mass and I'm going to be buried intact. Even if you're cremated, you still need to be buried intact. We shouldn't be scattering you about the woods. There's a lot of other things that you could be asking for during your lifetime. So for instance, we all know about last rites, but how about the apostolic pardon or the apostolic blessing? These are graces that we can receive that a lot of people are ignorant of, that if we ask for them and we have the right people as our agents in our documents, that they can actually request the priest to come in with the permission of the bishop and give us these graces. So I would ask that all of you go back to your attorneys, whether they're Catholic or not, and ask for these things. So this is what the story is really all about. These are the things that are really important. And the reason you put it in writing is so you know they get done. But think about what it actually says in the story of your life. The fact that you took the time to put these things in writing. It means that you really believe this. You think that this is really important. It was important enough for you to say, I want this specific person to make sure this gets done. That in and of itself tells a really important story and hands on the tradition from one generation to the next. That's part of your legacy. We sometimes forget that everything we do tells a story, and that's a really important part of the story to tell. And Paul, I don't know how much time I've got. Maybe got plenty of time? Okay. But these are really important things to consider. So estate planning is not just about stuff. It's really about people. It's about our souls. It's about the story that we want to tell. Now, that being said, that's the most important thing I want you to take away. Now, there are a lot of opportunities for us to tell really cool stories. Like my friend Mike in the back here, he's got so many great stories. Paul's got great stories. All of the guys that are sort of like wandering around from Christendom have great stories of sort of the transformations that they've seen in the lives of donors who, once they start giving, it really is life-changing. There's something really inspiring, enlightening, and people are nodding their heads. It's like, you don't realize how life-changing being part of something like an institution like Christendom is, or any worthy charitable cause. So I would also encourage you to talk to your financial advisors or your attorney about what are ways that I can either give now, if I can afford to do that, or in the future. Because, again, do your kids need everything that you have? Maybe. If you don't have a lot and they don't have a lot, maybe they do need everything that you have when you're gone. But does everyone's kids need everything? In most cases, no. I mean, even the widow who had nothing gave everything, right? Because God's going to provide for the living, right? He's going to take care of your kids in one way or another. So think about, God gave you these gifts to be stewards for the greater good of the whole community. And I don't mean that in a communistic kind of way, but God gave you these things to multiply and increase so that you could do something really good with it. And it shouldn't be sort of a self-centered or family-centered, it's just for you to make your life comfortable or enjoyable. Life should be fun. Life should be comfortable. Life should be enjoyable. That's what God always wanted for us. God made us for beauty and for love and for all good things. It's our fallen nature that we have to suffer these other things. But that doesn't mean that we should be indulgent or indulge our kids. And that's hard sometimes for us as parents to sort of think about, especially if you have kids who are saying, when you die, I want that. Or, I don't know if any of you have had that experience. Or who gets that when you die? Or how much are you leaving me when you die? Hopefully none of you have had that experience. But there's a lot of that out there. So I'd like you to think in broad terms when it comes to your ability to give. And you might be surprised in what can be done. So for instance, I know one of the challenges that we see quite often in the work that I do is a couple that maybe they don't have a whole lot. They have enough to live on, or maybe they're just fearful that we're going to run out because things are getting really expensive all of a sudden. How do I make my retirement last? How do I make sure that my spouse is taken care of when I die? How do I make sure there's enough for my younger kids, for their education, for their welfare? How do I give them something to help them get a start in life? But still, if I could, how can I do all of that and still give something to charity? I can't figure that out. Well, there's lots of things that we can do. So for instance, how many of you are familiar with what's called a gift annuity? A few of you, good. Good. So the contracts can be written up that say, if you leave something to a charitable institution, like say you have an IRA, a retirement account, and you would like money eventually to go to a charitable institution like Christendom, and you said, but I don't want to give it away now because what if my spouse needs that money? There can be a contract written up that says, if you leave that asset to Christendom, Christendom will make sure that there's money to take care of that spouse or that child, that there's income for life for those people or for a term of years. So there's lots and lots of things that we can do. So it's not just about giving up something, but it's about planning to benefit the college and potentially benefit your family. So don't just think, well, I can't do that. I'm not a multimillionaire. I don't have the funds to do these things. Anyone can come up with different ways of helping give. There's other types of things like retirement accounts that have directed giving as part of the investment account. So you can actually invest with an investment advisor. They can build up your investments. You have a tax benefit from putting money into it up front, so you get a tax deduction, and then you get to direct over time where you want the money to go. So you could say, well, I'd like to give money to Kristen right now, but I also know Mike Barvick. I don't know what he's going to do with this thing. It may go sideways, so I want to hold on to it for a while. But I also want to get my tax deduction. What do I do? Well, put it into this type of account. You get your tax deduction. You get to kind of wait and see how things go and parse it out a little bit at a time. So if you're just not ready quite yet to make that big commitment, there are ways to do it. There are charitable lead trusts, charitable remainder trusts, where you can put your assets into a trust, and you get a tax benefit up front. And in some cases, depending on the way the trust is written, you can still receive income from the trust during your lifetime. And then when you're gone, the assets can go to the charity, or it can even continue to throw off income for your children to make sure they're taken care of, but ultimately it still benefits the institution. So my point is that there's a lot of ways to approach this. So I would encourage you, if you're here, you're already probably a pretty generous person. Everyone here is a huge supporter of Christendom. So I have to assume that most of the folks here want to do something to help Christendom. So if there's something that you want to do and you just don't know how to do it, talk to someone like Mike or myself or your financial advisor about what are the ways to do those things. So that's all part of making sure that the story is written the way you want it to be written. That's what your legacy is all about. And finally, the most important thing I think you can do, it truly is leave a love letter for your children, if you have children, for your spouse. Think about the future and your future self. How many times have you wanted to tell someone that you're close to what you really feel about them, but you just feel like, that's just weird, or I'm uncomfortable doing that. I'm afraid of rejection, or they're going to misinterpret it, or it just seems weird. But don't you want them to know those things? So write it down. Write a letter that they get when you're gone, so you don't have to feel weird and you don't have to worry about rejection. But let them know how you really felt. Tell them that you love them. Tell them that you're proud of them. Tell them what your dreams were. Tell them what you didn't accomplish that you wish you'd accomplished that maybe they can accomplish for you. But tell them. That's the main thing, is tell them. And even for those parents who don't feel weird and are great friends with their kids and are telling them all the time how proud they are of them and how much they love them, still write it down. Because the kid that grew up with a parent who constantly is telling them that they love them, that they're proud of them, they're going to miss that when you're gone. So they can go back to that letter over and over again, and it just gives them, that reassurance. So do that. Write a letter. At this point, we can talk about all kinds of estate planning is a huge topic, and so some of you may have come with questions about estate planning, or what I said may have raised questions about estate planning. So at this point, I'd like to sort of open it up for discussion. So we'll go through, any questions that you have. If you have an experience that you want to share that you think is sort of pertinent to the discussion that we've had, share that, and then we'll sort of play off that until we get to the end of our time. Is there anyone? Yes, sir.
Here in the Diocese of Arlington, we have a form, and it's a very good form. I've had one filled out for end-of-life instructions, medical instructions. God forbid you have a massive stroke, or you're in a comatose state. And this is a very tough topic, very controversial, and something which many people in the legal profession, and even in our church, are uncertain about. But we have this form. I think you can order it online from the Diocese of Arlington. You fill that out and have your pastor sign this. Now, I had this with my parish, and make sure you've got a copy for yourself, photocopy for yourself, photocopy with your attorney and your primary care physician. I made it very clear during my last physical exam. It's right in there. Check it out. If God forbid something happens. No, you have to be assertive with these doctors.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yep. Yeah, so what Paul's talking about is it's called the Arlington and Richmond Diocese Advanced Medical Directive.
That's it.
Yeah. So Advanced Medical Directive, so in the olden days, we used to have what were called living wills. And living wills were legal documents, and they were, sometimes 10 pages long. And the legal will, or the living will would say, I want this person to make decisions for me. And they can make this kind of decision, this kind of decision, this kind of decision, basically go through the whole laundry list of the types of medical healthcare decisions that could be made. But it never really got into the details of the morality of medical decisions. What's a good decision versus what's an evil decision. After the Terry Schiavo incident in Florida, which many of you may remember, was about 23 years ago. So Terry Schiavo was a young woman, had a heart attack, almost died, was in what doctors called at the time a persistent vegetative state, which is a horrible description of what her condition was. She couldn't eat on her own. She couldn't drink on her own. She had to have a feeding tube. She had minimal ability to communicate. She could, squeeze a person's hand, that type of thing, or blink an eye. But beyond that, there was no communication. And no one really knew for sure, was she really communicating or was it just, a reflex? After about 10 years, her husband was getting tired and decided, you know what, I'd kind of like to move on. So, Doc, can't we just unplug her and let her go? Now, her parents and her brother were really devout Catholics, and they said, no, our Catholic teaching says we don't speed up death. Now, that doesn't mean we prevent the death from happening. That doesn't mean we have to take extreme measures to keep a person alive. But we aren't going to do anything that would speed up this person's death, like starve them to death or withhold water unreasonably from them if they can be hydrated. So, no, we're not going to cause her death. Well, he didn't accept that, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And you may remember it was during the whole Al Gore, Bush drama with the hanging chads in the Supreme Court and all of that. And this case came up at the same time. And bishops in this country were reluctant to opine on this and throw any support behind the Schiavo family because it was a hot issue. It was one of those sort of modern hot-button issues of, should we really get into between a doctor and their patient type of thing. So it caused a whole lot of consternation. It caused a whole lot of concern amongst faithful Catholics. How do we prevent ourselves and our loved ones from ending up in the same situation? She ultimately was taken off of the life support and died. How do we prevent that from happening? So in the wisdom of our bishops here in Arlington and in Richmond, they said, okay, we don't want this to happen with our folks. So they created this Advanced Medical Directive, which is a 3-part document. The first part allows you to appoint an agent to make medical decisions on your behalf. So if you're incapacitated, you're in a coma, you've had a stroke, you can't communicate, You appoint someone else to make medical decisions on your behalf. The second part talks about the morality of the types of decisions that you would want to have on your behalf. So for instance, there's a specific clause regarding, if I'm a woman and I'm pregnant, I don't want any procedure that would cause the death of my child. There's provisions about extending life unnecessarily. The Catholic Church has always taught that we should do our best to preserve life, but there's no expectation that we're going to go to the ends of the earth in order to do that, because we're going to die. Memento mori. We can't get around it. So this document is probably the best document in the country as far as advanced medical directives go. There are others around the country, but if you don't have one, you can get one by going to the website of the Arlington Diocese. It's on the family life portion of the site. Download it. You can also order it. You can call my office and we'll send it to you. It's a free document. Anyone can fill out. If you need help filling it out, talk to a good priest, talk to a good Catholic lawyer about how to check the boxes and fill it out depending on what your particular circumstances are. But that's probably the best that we've seen at this point in making sure that we're dying a moral death and we have the moral component built into our medical decision. So, Paul, thank you for bringing that up. That's incredibly important. Yep.
Can you give us a couple of minutes of Executor 101? How to pick it, what to make sure of, what?
Yep. So Mr. Rhodes is asking about executors. How do we pick an executor? I'm assuming what's their role in carrying out the execution of a will, those types of things. So we'll give you a real quick primer on how a will works and what probate is. So a will is an instruction that you give to your executor, who is someone that you have appointed, you've chosen, to carry out the distribution of your material wealth. That's what a will is, okay? It has to do with stuff. Does a will avoid probate? Does anyone know? It does not avoid probate. So a lot of people think, I can avoid probate if I have a will. It's not true. So the executor's role is to carry out the probate process. Probate is the movement of assets, stuff, from the hand of the deceased to the hands of whoever the beneficiaries are. That's what probate's all about. It's the court determining how to get the assets from point A to point B according to the terms of your will. So the executor should be someone that you trust is actually going to do a good job in protecting the assets, is not going to be seen as someone who's underhanded or taking advantage of the estate for their own self-benefit, and will, as quickly as possible, make sure that the assets get where you need them to go. Now, there's a lot to consider when choosing an executor. One, who do you trust that's going to do this the right way? They're not going to steal from your estate. That's first thing. Don't pick someone that's dishonest. Second thing, who do I feel has the time and the ability and the understanding to do this? Because it's a complicated process. It's a legal process. It's a time-consuming process. It can take up to a year in Virginia or more. And that's because there's a statute of limitations that has to run before assets can be distributed. And the executor should be someone who really wants to do it, not just can do it, but wants to do it. And there's a lot of reasons why someone may not want to do it. So for instance, traditionally, parents, for instance, would say, I want to name my oldest child, or I'll name all of my children to be co-executors. That may work out okay, but what happens when you appoint your oldest child and the two younger siblings resent it and make life hell for the oldest child who has to deal with the estate, and then it breaks the family apart when you're gone? Can that happen in your family? You have to look at your family and say, is that a possibility? What if my children don't have the time? Maybe they have children of their own that they're raising, or they're busy with their careers, or they live too far away. Maybe they're not the best people to do that. In that case, you may want to have a non-interested family member, like a friend, or a CPA, or an attorney, or just some colleague that can do this and is willing to do it for you. So there's a lot that goes into it, because it's not an easy position to be in. I don't know if any of you have ever had to be the executor of a will, but it's not a fun thing to have to go through. Any other questions specifically about that? Okay. But it is things to keep in mind about the probate process when you're an executor. If you have a will, or if you don't have a will, and you don't have a trust, your estate will likely go through some phase of probate. In Virginia, at least, and in most states, probate can take at least a year. It's very expensive. So while it may be less expensive to do a will versus a trust, the cost of doing a will and going through probate can be astronomically higher. So the average cost of probate in Virginia is about $12,000 versus, I don't know, a few $1,000s to have a trust prepared to avoid probate. And that's because while we have no estate tax in Virginia, we do have a probate tax. And the probate tax is based on the value of your estate. So when your executor takes the will and walks in and gives it to the clerk of the court, what does the clerk of the court ask first? How much is the value of the estate? Because the clerk wants to collect the tax, and that tax can be thousands of dollars. On top of that, then, the clerk's going to say, you know what, the state of Virginia doesn't trust you just to be a good person and not steal from the estate, so we're going to require you to purchase what's called a surety bond. So an insurance agent actually has to show up and swear a bond, and you have to pay for that. And that's typically $1,500 to $2,000, just so that you could promise you aren't going to steal from the estate. In addition to that, then the court has appointed what's called the Commissioner of Accounts, which is an attorney down the street from the courthouse whose sole job is to review the accountings and the paperwork that you've prepared as the executor and make sure that you've done it properly, that you haven't lost anything or taken anything that you weren't supposed to take, that everyone that's supposed to receive your property has received it, and that it's been done in a timely manner. And they get paid twice in the process. They get paid at the beginning, and they get paid at the end. So all along the way, it's just ding, 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 the cash register is going. So keep that in mind. If you are a parent with young children, traditionally in Virginia, if you had a will and you were a parent with young children or grandchildren and you wanted to leave money for their benefit, you don't leave money to children. You can't leave money to anyone under the age of 18 in Virginia. So you would create a trust. And it could be a testamentary trust through a will, or it could be a living trust. But it says, I want to leave a certain amount of money for the benefit of my children. And until they reach age X, let's say 22, I want a certain amount of money to be used for their welfare, for their education, their housing, what's called their maintenance. Well, guess what? In Virginia, if you do that through a will, the Commissioner of Accounts has to review that every single year. So if you have young children, the commissioner is getting paid every year to review the accountings on their trust. So if you have a 4-year-old and you want them to receive their trust money until they're 22 when they graduate from Christendom, well, guess what? You're going to have 18 years. Is that right? Yes, 18 years. I was not a math major. 18 years of fees that are being paid to the Commissioner of Accounts that's eating into your child's trust, their inheritance. So these are things that a lot of people don't realize. They think, oh, I'll just go online to LegalZoom and create a will and everything will be fine. But probate is something that's worthy of avoiding if it makes sense for you to avoid it. Now, there are ways to avoid it other than through trust. You can have beneficiary designations on accounts, like your bank account. A lot of people don't realize you can actually tell the bank who you want to receive the account upon your death. It's called pay on death or transfer on death, so you can do that on your bank accounts. Life insurance policies, obviously, they don't pay out until you're gone, so it has a beneficiary designation. Most of your retirement accounts have beneficiary designations. Even in real estate now, you can have a deed prepared where you say, I leave this property upon my death to these folks. So you can identify, and immediately upon your death, the property transfers to whoever you leave it to. Now, these are shortcuts to get these things done, so it's not without their risks. There's a lot of risk involved in all of those things. So some people think, oh, I've taken care of it. I've got my beneficiary designation set, but there's also risks associated with that. What if the person that you're leaving the money to passes away before you do, or at the same time as you do? Or what if they're receiving disability benefits from the government and you suddenly hand them a bunch of money and they lose their benefits? Or what if they have a drug or alcohol problem and suddenly you're feeding their drug and alcohol problem? So there's lots of things to think about when you're planning for your estate planning. But that was a great question. Any other stories or? Yes, ma'am. The question is, do I have to pay the executor, him or her? The answer is no, you don't have to. But under law, they're entitled to get paid if they choose to be. Yeah. Yeah. So it depends. So in Virginia, for the first $1 million, I believe it's 5% of the estate. And then after that, it goes down a percentage regularly. So I think by the time you get to $2 million or $2.5 million, it's like closer to 1%. But a lot of people will actually say, I've been an executor and I don't want anyone to have to do this for 5%. So they'll actually say, I leave them a specific amount. So you can actually leave a specific amount, or you can say, you can be silent on it. And, a lot of times family will just do it as a duty to the family, and so no one will get paid. But everyone, if it's a will, everyone's entitled to get paid under the statute. They can opt to get paid if they want to, but they don't have to be. Bill? Can you clarify it for me when you say it? Can you define kind of like what type of plan you're talking about? Yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, I talked earlier about how, especially for parents, it can sometimes be difficult to deny something to the children in order to do greater good with the resource. And whenever we donate to charities, in a certain sense, we're doing that. We're denying ourselves, we're denying our children the benefit of that resource, but we hope that they'll benefit from the greater good that that resource will do in the community. So I do think when children get to a particular age, it's good to sit down with them and explain to them why this is so important to you. So a lot of families, they just never have the discussions. They just put it into the documents, and then parents pass away, and the kids show up at the attorney's office, and they say, I'm here for my inheritance. And the attorney says, well, there's not a whole lot for you. It's mostly for Christendom. And they're like, what? So it's important to talk to them about it, because if they really understand why it's important, then, again, you're transmitting your legacy, but you're also sort of heading off some really hard feelings, because it gives them the opportunity to talk to you. And I know that can be really uncomfortable, but sometimes all it takes is that conversation with the children about why you're doing it, and an indication. And a lot of times when you tell a child, you know what, I'm doing this because I'm not worried about you. You're doing great. I've got hope that you're going to do so well. I don't think you need it. That's how good, I'm so proud of what you're doing. You don't need this. Sometimes that's all they need to hear. It's just that you think they've got it taken care of. And that's enough for them to say, okay, fine. Or, no, this is really important to me, and here's why. And explain why you're giving to the organization that you're giving to, so that they really understand and can begin to buy in. Now, there are some families who will go a little bit further. I know there's people in this room, for instance, who have created family foundations. And the family foundation allows them to take assets they have now or upon their death and put them into the foundation as a charitable contribution. And they get a tax deduction for their contribution, but they control that money through the foundation. And that's a great way not only to get your tax deduction and to control the funds so that you can sort of parse it out over time to different charitable endeavors, but you can get your kids involved. And it's fantastic to see folks with family foundations, especially with young kids, and encouraging the young kids to start making contributions of their own. You know, whether it's $50 or $10, whatever from their allowance into the family foundation. It's like when your little kids are putting the dollar in the basket during the collection at church. It teaches them to be generous. It teaches them to understand the importance of giving. And then when you're gone, it gives them a vehicle immediately to engage in the good work that you were doing. So again, it creates that continuity, that legacy, where your children can continue the good work that you started through your family foundation. Now, it's not for everybody, but it's certainly worth discussing if it's something that you're interested in. Is that helpful, Bill? Great. Yeah, Paul? Yeah, so the question from Paul was, how does it play out for folks that don't have children? And first, I need to apologize for Mike, because I just called him his brother's name, which is a cardinal sin in the Barvik family. But yeah, so Paul asks, okay, how does it change if you don't have children? And that's a very different dynamic. And in today's day and age, it's not unusual for there to be families that have done really well and they don't have children. But that doesn't mean they don't have things they don't really care about, or people that they don't really care about. So while it may not be the same as saying, okay, well, junior or daughter, here's what we're going to be doing, I think there's still a lot of opportunities for helping the community. You know, you have friends, you have a community at church, you have those things that you think are really important in the community, like a Christendom. Even if you're not in a position where you can start to give money right away, maybe some of you are, but you can leave a legacy to the school. You can leave a legacy to your church. You can leave a legacy to your community. So think of it in terms of, you know, how do I tell my story? And the great thing is, with most of these great charities like Christendom, they allow you to tell that story. You know, it's not just write me a check and hand it off to the school. It's woven into the tapestry of the story of Christendom. You know, it's not unusual for there to be stories about donors in the publications of the college. It's not unusual for folks like me and Paul to talk about the great gifts that have been given. It's not unusual to walk into the chapel and see the names of the people that you know were very generous. You can have that legacy woven in, even though you don't necessarily have biological progeny to carry on your name and your story can still be carried on through those gifts. Does that answer your question, Paul? Yeah. Yes. So the question is, can I name Christendom or a charity like Christendom as a beneficiary of an IRA? Oh yeah, you bet. Yes. Yeah. No, there's no limit. So IRAs are tricky. So it's always good to talk to your tax advisor and your attorney before you set up any type of beneficiary designation. But the answer to your question is yes, absolutely. And quite often, IRAs are the tools that most commonly will bring up the topic of an annuity. So for instance, I have an IRA and I want to make sure that my spouse is the primary beneficiary, but I want to make sure that the college ends up with the money. Well, I'm fairly young. I'm only almost 50. So if I pass away, my wife, she's going to find some other better-looking guy than I ever was and marry. So how do I know that when she dies, my IRA doesn't go to him, but I wanted to go to Christendom? So what you can do is you can say, I can still take care of her. I can leave the IRA to the college, and a guy like Paul or Mike can write up an annuity contract that says, we'll take care of them. We'll give them a payout while they're living. And then upon their death, the payout stops and the rest of the money stays with Christendom. So you accomplish your goal. You take care of your loved ones. You took care of the college. But yes, the bottom line is absolutely you can leave the college as the beneficiary of an IRA. Saw other hands. Yes, sir.
What about things like coin collection? I have a really special hunting rifle that's valuable, and stuff like, kind of special stuff.
That's a great question. Now, when you talk about, so the question is, what about special stuff I have, like a coin collection or a great collection of hunting rifles or something that may have, sentimental value but may also have other value to it too? How do we handle that? Now, tell me, what's your concern about those things? Is it, how do you use it as a gift to a charity, or how do you make sure it gets to the kids, or how do you maintain it? What specifically is the question?
Prefer it didn't wind up at Salvation Army store.
Yeah. That's a hard one. He says he prefers that it doesn't end up at the Salvation Army store. And it's not just personal property. So for instance, I come from a family that has 10 generations that lived on the same family farm. So you can imagine that we don't want that family farm to just be put on the auction block and sold to some stranger. We would love it to stay in the family if you can. Same thing with these sort of personal items that we have. You may have your grandmother's wedding ring. You don't want that going down to the pawnbroker. So within your estate planning documents, you can first of all say, I want to make sure that this item goes to this particular family member who I know will cherish it and keep it in the family. So that it's always wise to put that in writing. But you can also put contingencies that say, but if they don't want it, then I first want someone else in the family to have the option of having that thing. Or if no one in the family wants it, then I want it to go to extended family, or in the case of a farm, you could say, some type of a foundation who would continue to use it as a farm and not cut it up into housing development. There's all kinds of ways to create contingencies. And I tell my clients all the time, if you can imagine it and it's not illegal, we can usually do it. Yeah. So it's just a matter of having that conversation about what's precious, why it's precious, and how you want it to be sort of taken care of once you're gone. Any other? Yeah, Paul? That's right. And there's a lot of different ways, creative ways to do this. And again, it takes the expertise of great philanthropy officers and attorneys and accountants to make sure that we're doing it the right way so that it actually works. But again, if it's not illegal, we can usually make it happen. So there are ways for you to benefit from your own gifts in certain ways during your lifetime, or for your children to benefit from those gifts. So, yep, we certainly don't discount that. Yes, ma'am. Potentially. So the question is, what if I'm leaving money to a charity and there's really no one in my family to kind of left to kind of keep an eye on things, and the charity goes south or isn't doing what I intended to do? Is there a way to kind of pull it back or redirect it to make sure that, the assets are, and I'm assuming it's like, when I wrote my will, the, Catholic, whatever that fund was back in the 80s and 90s that everyone loved, was doing great. Yes. Yeah. And yeah, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. I want to give to that. And then, 20 years later, you realize, oh, man, I'd like my money to go somewhere else, but maybe I passed away before that gets changed. Yes, if you can put in your documents specific stuff like, I'm leaving it to the Catholic Campaign for Human Development so long as they continue to do this type of good work, you open the door for there to be discretion for whoever your agent is, whether that's your executor or your trustee. So as long as you give some discretion, and it's a double-edged sword. Discretion is double-edged because you're also opening the door for them to say, well, I don't like that organization, so I'm going to redirect. So you have to kind of balance the discretion versus it going where you originally intended to direct it. So, but yes, the answer to your question is there can be, to a certain extent, contingencies. But just like I tell my clients, if you can imagine it and it's not illegal, you can do it, or we can get it done. I also say, we can't cover every contingency, so don't think too far into the future. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen a generation from now. We don't know what's going to happen an hour from now. So don't think too hard. Just do based on what you know and what you can anticipate reasonably. That should be the level of planning you do. We cannot anticipate everything.
Friends of ours are reading a book, Die with Zero. What do you think about, not trying to just leave this big thing at the end, but do things now?
Yeah. So the book's title is Die with Zero. Now there's a lot of different sort of philosophies tied to that sort of. Okay. And I'm not saying it's a bad book, but Mike and I have talked about this. It's hard when you're an estate planner and you say, hey, let's do some planning. Or you're a philanthropy officer and you say, hey, could you leave something to our charity when you pass? And someone says, oh, I'm going to spend it all before I die. There's going to be nothing left. I've never met anyone who actually spent it all before they died that hadn't already spent it before they were 20. It just doesn't happen. It's a mentality. It's a wish that I think a lot of people, it's like, I've worked hard, I'm going to have fun, I'm going to enjoy myself. But the reality is, as we get older, we're less confident about tomorrow. We want to make sure there's still something left for tomorrow. So how do you spend it all before you die, unless you know exactly when you're going to die? Now, the concept in its proper term is, well, I don't need all of this, so let's start to give it away and make good use of it now, which is what a philanthropy officer like Mike is trying to do, is like saying, well, hey, you're not going to use it, so let's put it to some good use now. That's the proper sort of lens to look at, Die with Zero. I don't think the concept is actually workable, that you'll actually die with zero, but you can certainly say, I'm going to keep less of this. And like I've said, there are ways to have sort of stopgap measures that if you need it, you can pull it back or you can still get some benefit. But certainly you could say, I'm going to have next to nothing left when I die because I've already provisioned it for these other good purposes. And a lot of parents, they make the mistake of thinking, well, I want to provision it for the good purpose of my children. So they'll make the mistake of taking a deed, for instance, and adding their child's name to a deed or turning their house over to their child while they're still living. That's very generous, and it's a noble idea that I want to give my property to my child. But what happens if that child gets into a car accident and hurts someone else, and they get sued, and they have a judgment against them? The judgment attaches to the property that there is in their name, which just happens to be the house that you're living in. Or what if you say, I want to make it easy for my child to help take care of my finances, so I'm going to add them to my bank account as a signer or a co-borrower on my bank account. I know we have one more minute before we run out of time, but this is really important. Don't put your kids on as owners of your bank accounts. If they get into trouble, they have a gambling problem, a credit problem, they have a judgment against them, guess what? That judgment attaches to your bank account because they are owners of your bank account. So while it seems like it makes sense to do that, don't do it. There are other ways to make sure that they can still access and take care of those accounts for you. But Paul, I want to say thank you. 6 or 7 years has been great, and it's great to see so many of you. I hope to see you at dinner, but thank you once again.